All about leading edge technology. I'm VP of Engagement, John Collins.
And I'm COO, Howard Holton.
And this week, we'll try and cut through the jargon and give you what you need to make sense of it all. In this case, we're going to be talking about all things 5G. And I'd love to introduce Karl Connolly, so let's do it. Straight in, Karl. What brings you here? Here to talk about 5G. What's your background? What's the skinny?
Hey John, hey Howard, thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm Karl Connolly. I've been in tech since 2000. I really started my career at a company called EMC Corporation. I'm sure many of your viewers will know that. I actually spent about 17 years there, believe it or not, and wore a lot of different hats over that time, as you can imagine. Started as a hardware software engineer. I kind of worked then in integrations. I was there at a great time when EMC was buying a lot of different technologies, so got to play around in the lab quite a bit. And I also worked in QA and worked on customer issues. And from there, I really got into corporate systems engineering and emerging technologies. After EMC, I transitioned into the legal field, believe it or not. So I'm a practicing attorney in Massachusetts, where I live. However, after 3 years in the legal field, kind of missed technology and had the opportunity to step back in. And I went to work for a major distribution company called Ingram Micro. So I spent 6 years at Ingram as a chief technologist. And now I'm happy to say with my partner, we founded a new company called Net Maven. And Net Maven is dedicated to helping channel partners, distribution partners, OEMs, and some of the carriers help evangelize 5G into the enterprise.
I'm just wondering. Well, there's so much to unpick there, and I'm just really worried because we go down rabbit holes on this podcast. And Howard's got a legal background.
We've never done one rabbit hole. I don't know why you would malign the history of this podcast.
We're literally going down a rabbit hole about rabbit holes now. That's very meta.
Well, my real name's Alice. So
yeah. Mine's Neo. I just I don't like to. So in what you're doing, channel related, but here to talk about 5G. What brings you into the 5G space?
So interesting enough, I started in the 5G journey about 4 or 5 years. That was actually just prior to COVID, and I was actually representing the carriers at distribution. So I represented AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. So needless to say, they're all in the 5G space, and 5G was just coming into enterprises' radar, if you will. And we had a lot of channel partners, obviously, that we support that really didn't know a lot about the benefits that 5G could offer. And so I worked very closely with the carriers to kind of extract from them what the true value was to enterprise, and then more importantly, how channel partners could potentially ride that wave and monetize 5G. So I looked at a lot of their particular solutions, their differentiation, and ultimately, while I was at Ingram for the corporation itself, I developed what we'll call a 5G framework called SIM to Cloud. And John, the whole notion behind that effort was really to help channel partners understand how they could work closely with the carriers, leverage the carriers' expertise, but more importantly, also have some skin in the game, so to speak. So learning from the carriers, working with the carriers. What's very interesting is here in the US, most of the carriers that I dealt with, or the groups within the carriers that I dealt with, were hands down experts on cellular. Obviously, that's what they do. But when it came into workflow, applications, data center, cloud, cybersecurity, they were kind of lacking that. And the same is true for channel partners on the flip side. They didn't have the cellular expertise. So the framework really put them together in a symbiotic relationship and helped bring those two parties together. So spent a lot of time doing that, 4 years, learning the ins and outs of the business. And then ultimately, what I decided to do with my partner this year is spin off and develop a 5G consultancy to serve that market with a greater level of specificity.
Got it. I mean, I'm kind of, without going in depth into your portfolio, I'm kind of thinking. So clearly, there's a problem to be solved here. And you've already mentioned that it's the communications side of things and just understanding what the heck
Yeah.
I've been talking to. I'm just back from MWC as well, so I'm
Oh,
like
right.
kind of a wall of 5G sound. You know, just hit me.
And 6G now, I'm sure, right?
Well, there's an interesting one because 5G is kind of, it's kind of struggling to get out still, even though it's out. So 6G is kind of, we'll do that later.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Much later. Yeah. No, I
But-
don't disagree with you, and that's in part the reason that we formed Net Maven. It's to help 5G with adoption. So there's plenty of use cases. There's a lot of opportunity. In one area in specific, healthcare is primed for 5G. If you think about healthcare, the biggest challenges that they have now is the digitalization of a lot of their records, and everything's now mobile. And so when you think about a big hospital, just the structure alone, huge area, lots of compartmentalized locations, lots of concrete, lots of glass, lots of impediments to wireless. And yet the clinicians need to be mobile, and they need to have ubiquitous coverage across a very large area, and they need to have that data reliable. And more importantly, now we're starting to see, and I was just at Vive conference last week, which was fascinating, is that the whole healthcare industry is pivoting towards health in the home. So if you think about hospitals who are trying to extend their services in a continuous method, they'll need a wireless protocol that enables them to do that. And Wi-Fi just can't do that. It was never really designed for that. And that's where healthcare organizations are now starting to realize that, hey, we can engage the carriers and employ a hybrid 5G deployment that will provide us ubiquitous coverage on-prem for what we need to do for our communications, collaborations to aid workflow. But now, more importantly, to extend services out into the field such that patients can now stay in their home and get service and quality of service over a secure connection. So we're seeing lots of traction in that space specifically.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point there, right? When we look to traditional wireless technology provided by the carriers, the
Yeah.
reason Wi-Fi worked was the performance was night and day difference, right? I remember getting my first wireless at home, and it blows away the 2G that was available, much less the 3G and then the LTE and the 4G LTE that came later.
Yeah.
Right? When we look to 5G, that's another kind of evolutionary leap in speed and performance. But that's
It
not
is.
at all what we're concerned about here. Sure, we have to have minimums, right? But
Yeah.
when it comes to security, when it comes to density, when it comes to rate of response and latency, 5G is a night and day difference. And I think those things get missed, which is why this is not about your mobile phone.
Oh, definitely not about the mobile phone. You're absolutely right. 5G is really a massive leap forward over 4G for all the reasons you just described, Howard. But in addition to that, architecturally, it's actually very different. If you look at 5G, it's architected much like a modern containerized application. That is to say, 5G is a services-based architecture that is an unlocked ecosystem, so to speak. Where in the past, if you were deploying a 4G network, you'd go to Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia, and you get what was kind of a closed ecosystem. Now, with the advent of 5G, and this is a true standalone architecture where it's not reliant on any of the previous 4G elements. So adhering to the new radio standard, that's all services based. So to your point, Howard, that opens the door for innovation because it's created things like the ability to do network slicing, which is essentially to create a virtual slice of a network with specific attributes: latency, performance, security, reliability, using a low band, mid band, or high band, or a combination of all three, depending. And that's really interesting from an enterprise perspective, because it ushers in a whole set of new use cases that heretofore just weren't possible. So it's pretty exciting stuff.
I think it's really interesting when we start looking at things like software defined networks and network operating systems, right? One of the things that we've been talking about from an analyst perspective is how are you considering 5G? How does 5G fit into the plan? Which then gets into a whole conversation about what you just talked about, right? About the architectural differences within 5G that I don't think customers are attentive to. Not the least of which is because it is this containerized system. It allowed us to really inject and wrap the entire thing in security layers that are simply impossible with prior wireless technologies. It is not possible to secure LTE the way 5G is secured, which allows for things like the Stingray box, which allows for things like hackers to build a 3G standalone man in the middle network attack that is effectively undefeatable. It is not possible to do that with 5G.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I work exclusively from a carrier perspective with T-Mobile, and T-Mobile in the US is the only carrier that has a true 5G standalone network at this particular time and this particular date. And what they've been able to do with their network with respect to security is light years ahead of the competition, in the sense that they're able to actually embed security concepts like SASE, zero trust, into their core network, and their core then is distributed. So that means, from a privacy and security concept, if you're a hospital or a financial company and you're looking for a specific slice of network that has intrinsic security, not just the elements of the 5G standard, but additional capabilities like SASE, they can offer that. And of course, when it's containerized, you're able to move those services closer to the edge. And that's really where the marriage of MEC and 5G help drive innovation.
So I think because you bring up T-Mobile and security, we need to talk about. There's a little that brings an elephant into the room that I think we need to mention, because T-Mobile has had 3 security incidents that I'm aware of.
Yeah,
right? It is important for people to understand that's on the billing side. That has nothing to do with the 5G network.
That's right. That's right. It's unfortunate. Like every enterprise, when you hear about these things in the news, you automatically think, oh, it's the network that was compromised. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to 5G and the network, the actual network of 5G, as you said, the 5G standards themselves are light years ahead in terms of encryption and specific services that insulate it so much better than a 4G network. And they also have released something called T-SIM Secure in conjunction with Versa, which is embedded SASE on the SIM itself. So from an endpoint perspective, from a core perspective, a lot of safeguards are in place.
Go ahead. I'm gonna pretend I want to ask you about challenges and what's getting in the way, but actually I've got a kind of hidden agenda, because I was speaking to a mobile company who may have had something to do with Richard Branson, but I couldn't possibly comment. And they said one of their biggest challenges was skills. So we can talk about containers, we can talk about all these wonderful ways that you can build stuff. They just don't know. I mean, I'm not speaking specifically, they don't know, but there's a gap between all the things you need to know and what they know currently. That's quite big.
There is a huge gap, and that in part is one of the main reasons I love working with T-Mobile. They have a group called ANS. It's called Advanced Network Solutions. And if you cast your mind back to how I opened the call with the SIM to Cloud framework, that, John, is a method by which enterprises can literally engage with the carrier team, specialized team that will really go in. I'll give the audience an example here, but really go in and assess the actual business case, the outcomes that the enterprise is trying to accomplish, and look at it holistically, and then come back with a solution. So we worked with T-Mobile and a partner in the Northeast in the US here last year on a deployment of a hybrid 5G solution for a hospital. So the hospital was going through an Epic install, Epic upgrade. So Epic is a electronics health record system, and it basically would mandate that 60% or more of the network traffic would be mobile, just because of the clinicians were on the go and they needed roaming and the like. And so they looked at doing that with Wi-Fi. And to provide Wi-Fi coverage for 3 million square feet, as you guys know, is very expensive. The amount of access points that you need to put into a hospital just to give you mediocre coverage at best is very expensive. So when we did the analysis and brought in the experts from the carrier that could work in conjunction with the consulting company, the VAR, it was like a very symbiotic relationship. They both brought specific skill sets to the table. So the carrier was able to supplement, complement, and augment that partner's gap in cellular. and round out the team. So I would say, you know, that model really works because you're basically acquiring the hybrid 5G as a service. The core runs in the cloud. The radios are on-prem. The entire 5G network is managed, monitored, and secured by the carrier, just like it would be when you're consuming it on your cell phone. But in that regard, you know, it really lowered the technical barrier to entry, because at the end of the day, they're acquiring it like a service, like they would say their cloud. Why do you offload your data center to the cloud? Because you don't want to manage the cloud. You don't want to be up at night watching blinking lights and be on the hook when things go wrong. Plus, you get the benefit of constant upgrades. So in this model, specifically with T-Mobile, who I represent in the US as a partner, this is a managed service, and that's how it's acquired. So you are right, though. There's also another issue here. It's when you get into these enterprises that have large IT departments, and you're now evangelizing the fact that 5G can be a complement to Wi-Fi, not a replacement, but a complement for new business cases or to help them modernize and transform. Sometimes the IT department, as you guys know better than most, will say, no, it's something new. It's outside of our comfort zone. We don't need that. Wi-Fi is good enough. You know, so that's a bit of a challenge. So there's a couple of challenges. How do you sell it into IT? You definitely need, you know, a champion in the account. But the fact that this is a managed service and offered as an OpEx model too also helps, because it's taking that financial sting out of it.
That really resonates. Sorry, I just throw in an anecdote. I was actually foray into being CTO of a startup where I was in a hospital trying to get mobile stuff rolled out, and one of the issues was the IT department was outsourced, and the networking element of that was it was all just kind of, who do we speak to? Oh, well, it's so and so, but they're only here 2 days a week because they're part of that subcontract, and it was a nightmare. To get through to the right people, even, never mind.
Yeah, it can be. You know, if anything new, typically, as you know, with some IT departments is, you know, they're the office of no. We don't want that because we don't know it. And yet the business needs it, because 5G for a hospital is becoming existential. The kinds of services that they want to offer, the amount of digitalization, the amount of data that now devices are creating, the amount of connected devices in the hospital is mind-blowing. While I appreciate a lot of them are still on Wi-Fi, new devices that are coming out are eSIM enabled, so they are 5G capable. And I would expect that pendulum to shift even greater over the next couple of years, where more devices. In fact, I was at the Honeywell conference 2 weeks ago, and they're super excited about 5G. That was one of the main topics of their talk, that they're bringing out a bunch of new 5G devices, tablets, handsets, and others. And so the market's catching up, and I think you know, enterprises are coming around. But if you can really truly leverage the capabilities of a capable carrier, and they're channel centric, which is really important, because in the past they were not, that's a marriage made in heaven, because you've got that partner that has the, you know, the role, the relations and the context of the business case, and really understands the workflow. And they impart that knowledge then to the carrier specialized team that can kind of then do the Rosetta Stone as to what it will actually take to impart a best-in-class solution. And the other thing I'll say to you is, hospitals aside, you know, whether it's airports or, you know, industrial manufacturing, when you employ a 5G network, as you guys are aware, you're future-proofing that network. That's 5G is going to be the standard, even though we kind of laughed about it. But 6G until 2030 comes out with 6G, and then, you know, it's going to be a couple more years before 6G is going to be adopted. So there's a long runway here. And so if you really want to leverage a network that's programmable, highly secure, amazing bandwidth, super low latency, and you want to usher in a whole set of new use cases and device density at a cost that's right, I think it's a no-brainer.
So I think there's two things that I heard that I kind of like to touch on. The first is there's a huge amount of fear around 5G, not just because it's different, but because it is substantially different. It is the first fully zero trust network, right? That requires a different mindset than traditional networks.
It does indeed. You're absolutely right. And sometimes, Howard, when we get into a conversation, it's very interesting it's the CISOs who pick up on this, so it's different kind of stakeholders as well. It's not the traditional networking folks that you're talking to.
For sure.
You got to sell the holistic value prop, and from a CISO perspective, they really get it and they latch onto it. But you're right, there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of opposition, and it takes a lot of work because it is a sea change. It's a complete change of network architecture, and obviously a change in approach, methodology, workflow, tool sets, and the like. But at the same time, if you really get into a business conversation, like when we talk about 5G, we never talk about 5G as a lead, much to the chagrin of the carriers, because they have their own pitch, which is fine because that's their asset. But from our perspective, we're like, okay, wait, let's have a conversation about the business. What are you trying to do? What are the objectives? Where are you trying to go? What are your aspirations? What are your pain points? What use cases are you trying to do that you can't do today over your existing Wi-Fi or wired connection? And what's the budget for growth? And then with those things, you can slowly and surely start to pick off where 5G is a really good fit. Now, is it a good fit for everything? Absolutely not. I'd be a liar here if I'm sitting here trying to convince you that it is. But for the vast majority of things, especially future things, it is a good fit. And then you can get into the financial aspect of it and do the ROI of it versus, say, a Wi-Fi in a very large deployment, specifically as a managed service, and it starts to really make sense. And then get into the true technical merits of it, and that's the kind of approach we take, that three-pronged approach, as opposed to kind of 5G, because their eyes are going to roll back in their head first, because they just, as you said earlier, they don't get it. They think, that's for my phone.
Well, and everybody says I have Wi-Fi.
Yes, exactly. They do.
Replaced.
I hear it all the time.
Which is the other thing I kind of wanted to mention, because every time we hear managed service, every time we hear something new, what we think is, that's going to cost a substantial amount of money. Yeah. And I looked at I did some research for a different project, nothing related to this podcast, but it was effectively comparing upgrading a warehouse to enable an IoT production line with wireless versus 5G.
Okay.
Managed 5G specifically. And what I found was the cost was similar enough from a high level kind of understood cost perspective, that it was a wash. And then it really came down to the technology, which was frankly shocking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's not the first time I've heard that too. I've been involved with another partner that does private 5G. And they have that use case specifically around the cost of warehouses. And these are very large footprints, as you know. So to cover that with traditional access points with Wi-Fi, you get mediocre coverage at best. And then when you start to kind of look at it like the totality of the deployment and what they're actually trying to do, and all the tangential issues that could potentially go wrong with respect to downtime or efficiency or cost per minute, I think cellular is a really good viable alternative in those solutions. Now, I'm not here trying to pitch that cellular is the second coming of Christ. There are certain use cases where Wi-Fi is completely sufficient, and that's fine. But I think in the larger deployments where latency is absolutely critical, or roaming is important, that's the other thing. If you think about use cases like with airports and you're out in the apron and things like that, and then look at the economics, it really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider density and the challenges Wi-Fi has in what is unfortunately a very narrow band.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if I've got to cover 200,000 square feet or 1 million square feet, I effectively have to be a Wi-Fi expert to make that work in the way that I want that to work. It was interesting. I used to do video surveillance for LAPD.
Oh, right.
The complexity around that.
Oh, yeah.
Really was, you have to be a data expert, you have to be a wireless expert, and you have to be a lens expert.
Wow.
Right? And that was a place where people tended to make a mistake, is they were either the camera expert, in which case they could say, okay, so this is the field of view we're trying to capture. This is the distance we're trying to capture. Here's the resolution we're starting with. and this is kind of the lens we need for this space, and the lens we need for this space, and the lens we need for this space.
Wow.
Granted, we get around a lot of that now with resolution, but it still plays an important part. You kind of have the same problem in wireless, right? I have to think about network propagation. I have to think about reflection and refraction. I have to think about penetration of wireless signal. And then I have to think about overlap in radio frequencies in order to provide something so that when that forklift goes down that really tight path between two giant pallet racks,
Yeah.
the Wi-Fi signal doesn't just suddenly vanish, right? I don't hit a dead spot in that corner. And
Yeah. Especially with the rollout of all of these autonomous vehicles and the like, you really have to think about, you're absolutely spot on, the spectrum. Because with 5G, a lot of people don't really understand that unlike 4G, it actually consists of 3 different classes or ranges of spectrum: low band, mid band, and then the millimeter wave or high band. And they all have different attributes. Some good, some bad, some indifferent. But when it comes to something like autonomous vehicles or in the warehouse, you certainly don't want handoffs. And so getting the right mix of spectrum is very, very important. Yeah.
I was going to ask, is it an either or thing ultimately? I mean, sure, you could have 80% of your stuff on 5G, but then kind of because then it becomes a question of flipping from one to the other of the actual handoff.
Yeah, I think at this particular time, John, it's not one versus the other. It's a better together story. What's really important, though, I think, when you're thinking about deploying a 5G network, and as Howard said, this is a sea change. So it's really, you got to sit down and plan and really understand, your use cases, your workflow. And then if you can separate or segregate which workflows arguably go to 5G and which stay on Wi-Fi, you're going to get a much better return on your investment. And not to keep harping on about it, but that was the exact case at the hospital. They had already invested a huge amount of money in Wi-Fi. So they didn't want to just throw that investment away. So by offloading the mission critical workloads that were taxing the crap out of that Wi-Fi onto 5G, now all of a sudden they have, a freed up Wi-Fi spectrum for guests and other things, TVs and stuff like that, things that aren't critical. So, yes, they had to invest in a new 5G deployment, but it's very complementary. And in fact, the design mandated, God forbid, a cellular network goes down, what happens then, right? It had to fall back to Wi-Fi. So it really takes a good, capable partner to really understand what the use cases is and what the tolerances are and the like.
I'm thinking about data movement as well, because I think if it is X-rays and blood results and so on and so forth, you absolutely want all that zero trust stuff. You don't want to, and it's kind of, you want the centralized control of security. Whereas if it's the patient stuff, you don't want to know precisely what they're doing, but you can use Wi-Fi to know where they are, or the fact there's a big queue next to the vending machine, or whatever. And so putting services on the Wi-Fi for patients might make more sense. And you care less about reliability, obviously. If they lose their signal for a while.
Yeah, you're spot on. In these heavily regulated industries where HIPAA and PCI in finance, all of that needs to be isolated. But if you're just kind of doing an asset tracking or a patient monitoring without any kind of sensitive personal information, then there's a place for Wi-Fi there. That's why it's definitely better together. And then in fact, when we first started pitching 5G, we were always trying to make the case for one versus the other. But as we started to talk to more enterprises, it was like, this is ridiculous. These things have to work together, and they will. And as Wi-Fi standard starts to evolve and improve, the lines will probably blur even more.
Well, Wi-Fi 7, that's a good point, right? Wi-Fi 7 has the potential to blur those lines when it's fully implemented in some reasonably large ways, which is good to see, because as we talked about before, right, the network architecture of 5G is a net win for everyone. And then as we see Wi-Fi 7 and what will likely be something like a Wi-Fi 7 Plus adopt more and more of that, we'll see more blurring. I do think it's important for people to understand, right? The some of the best use cases for 5G are those things that you don't even have today.
That's true. I'm always surprised about what's coming and talking to lots of partners and lots of vendors. it's very interesting, you know, the fusion of AI and the capabilities that that can bring to devices, but that needs really low latency network access. A lot of those services run in the cloud, so to get uninterrupted, you know, connectivity, 5G is a great enabler. I call it like an innovation platform rather than a network, because that's what it is. But there are other use cases too, like in the short term that our customer, your listeners maybe should be considering, like fixed wireless access, the ability to get, you know, 5G internet without having to run a cable in the ground with near cable speed is liberating. And we're starting to see that huge in retail, in fact, are making the switch, ditching their old legacy ISPs for 5G connectivity. And I know, Howard, too, you're involved in 5G connected laptops. You know, the ability now, as you're probably frequent travelers yourselves, like having a laptop that's always connected without having to like worry about whose Wi-Fi am I surfing, is also a huge opportunity, especially for channel partners. Coming up with Windows 11, that's going to mandate an update of a laptop anyway, most likely. Windows 12 next year, Copilot and other AI tools. All of that stuff needs always on, always reliable, low latency, highly secure connectivity. So lots of opportunities.
Well, and before the audience dismisses it, the endpoint is the problem, right?
100%.
The endpoint gets compromised. The endpoint is the problem. As soon as the endpoint is compromised, they are now in your network. Whether that's a low blast zone or a high blast zone is dependent on the next stage of your network design. Right. But part of the advantage to 5G is not just making sure that your people are connected all the time, but demotivating them from using less secure connection points that they were probably using anyhow.
Absolutely.
Right? Oh, I connected to the Wi-Fi at the Starbucks without actually connecting to but I actually connected to the impersonating device sitting in someone's backpack, or that captive portal had been compromised and replaced because the Wi-Fi they're using isn't secure. I'm not picking on Starbucks, just anyone, right? If you can just eliminate that step, and remember, they have to be connected for your VPN to connect. So there's a period of time that they are connected to a completely unsecure network. And then God forbid they forget and then try to connect to services. We have so many SaaS services that's entirely reasonable. 5G removes that. So I did this test with a 5G laptop and I took it to several different cities, right? All through Oregon, from Bend to Portland. And I never connected it to any wireless. I just used the 5G the entire time. Right?
It's liberating.
But outside of home, I didn't connect it to a wireless network because it wasn't just about liberating. It was I no longer had to think about a thing. So I never had to look for wireless. I never had to think, do they have wireless here? Right?
Yeah.
If the network was present, it worked.
You bring up a great point, Howard. I was talking to the CIO of a major university 2 weeks ago, and she was telling me about the issues she has with students, right? Their data was compromised, and so huge breach. And it's just that they don't think. They're not thinking, right? They're just a classic, typical end user. So if you can take that away by embedding the security in the SIM, that's half the battle, right? So you're intrinsically providing them a secure device, and that's just perfect for the user because they don't have to think about it. And that solution works really good too with IoT. You know, a lot of IoT devices that have SIMs or eSIMs, you know, they don't have sophisticated operating systems. So you can't install like a traditional, you know, antivirus client or whatever. But if you can put that into the SIM where the device itself is now intrinsically secure, that's taking out the Achilles heel of a lot of those endpoint issues.
We could do a whole other podcast on eSIMs. I think the potential of, because that's the liberating bit, isn't it? It's then being able to set credentials from any device, and they're expanding rapidly. And you mentioning students, and I'm not picking on students. I'm thinking the old adage of never put down to malice what can be ascribed to stupidity. But then there's also malicious stupidity, isn't there? It's just like, I don't care. I'm just gonna bulldoze my way through this because I just need access right now.
Yeah, and I'm gonna sound like an old geezer now, but you know, I think young people, they're just so used to having everything connected all the time, right? So it sometimes doesn't even come into their mind. Like I was listening to some of the students, and my eyes were rolling back in my head. It's like, holy cow, I can't believe they're so nonchalant about protection of their data, but that's just the way it is. So as an organization or provider, or as the custodian of the service, you have to be thinking about these things for them and making it seamless and frictionless. And that's kind of.
I did dial up to connect to this podcast, by the way.
I was wondering what that kind of funky sound was.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you talk about that, right? It's something that I've said frequently, and I'm happy to say it again because I don't think you can hear it enough. We have a responsibility to be good custodians of our customers' data. That requires good, not only using it responsibly and using it ethically, but securing it in every reasonable way, right?
Really? Yeah.
There's a lot we can do that's not reasonable. I'm not saying we need to be unreasonable. However, I'm seeing a lot of failure around reasonability, right? So security still needs to be implemented. And guys, like, come on, you are in fact the custodian of your customers' data. So treat it with respect. I see too many cases where that's just simply not happening, right? Where the flaws in the system are huge, but also the flaws in the execution are huge, right? Employees completely disregarding security and working around the security because it is easier for them, completely disregarding the fact that their charge, that customer has now been exposed in a way that they never should have been exposed, right? You wouldn't want that done to you. Why would you do that to your customer?
Yeah, and it happens at the highest levels, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's kind of constant, right? So I do have to say, if anyone from Apple is listening, we need 5G in those devices, guys, right? One of the big flaws in the mobile endpoint is in fact the Apple, not the lack of participation from Apple, right?
Yeah, I mean the iPhone, obviously the iPad,
For
very
sure.
widely used, but I think MacBook Pros, so waiting for one of those to
Yeah, the Pro in the air, right? I'm kind of holding off my next MacBook purchase, hoping that they're going to integrate 5G, right? I've got my cellular iPads, I've got my cellular phone. I'd really like cellular in my next Air or Pro.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, to be honest. Not that I have one, but I don't have one. The Vision Pro, it's Wi-Fi only, and I'm thinking, my God, some of those users are probably going to experience a lot of seasickness because with latency over Wi-Fi. I was just like, why wouldn't they go intrinsically with 5G for that thing?
I mean, so where was I? I was at a hotel in Dallas Fort Worth, trying to use my Vision Pro. So that shouldn't be a surprise. And the maximum bandwidth I could get out of the hotel's wireless was 0.5 megabyte, 537 kilobytes per second.
Brutal. Yeah, it defeats the purpose, right? It's just a horrible experience.
Well, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't watch I had to watch commercial television, which I just turned off.
What a horror.
You almost have to go down and speak to people. I mean, good Lord.
I know. I don't mean this to sound like a horrible first world problems, but legitimately haven't watched commercial television in a decade, I guess. I didn't realize how horrible it was. And it's to the
call the Pro to give out.
Yeah. It's bizarre how the expectation is that connectivity is ubiquitous.
Exactly.
Right? I couldn't imagine staying at a hotel where they're like, yeah, we don't provide in-room Wi-Fi.
Yeah. No,
right? And yet I'm
dark
ages exist.
We're going to have to wrap soon. So is there any what's the on-ramp, if you like? Because you could say to a hospital, just kit out the whole thing again. But realistically, what's the starting point for knowing whether or not 5G is going to be an option for your organization?
If your business is experiencing issues with collaboration, communication, and has mobility needs, then you're seriously going to have to consider Wi-Fi or 5G today, honestly. And that's everybody.
Simple as that.
Yeah, simple as that. The world is going more and more digital, right? There's more and more data, as you guys know, being produced, more and more endpoints, and people need instant access to that data. And Wi-Fi is just not designed for mobility.
Because I'm kind of thinking it's not just, I mean, with storage, for example, it's at the end of the 3 years, reconsider, and there's all, whereas this is just kind of, it's a now thing, isn't it, almost?
Yeah, and I know we're trying to wrap, so I'll keep it brief. But one of the beauties of 5G, as you're probably aware, with that containerized services-based architecture, upgrading that's like upgrading an application, right? So you'll get your constant and frequent updates in an agile method. So this new standard allows enterprises to tap into a service that is constantly upgraded. So they don't have to even think about that aspect of it, which is very, very important. Because back in the day, you know, if it was a locked box, you'd be at the mercy of the OEM to release an update. Now that stuff is coming from 3GPP, you know, every year or so, new standards and new upgrades. And if you're with a carrier that offers that as a service, you're going to get the benefits of that as a service. Always modern, always new, always innovative.
Yeah,
So
to your point, right? It's a software-defined radio, so it truly is driven by that software stack. There's very, very, very little upgrading of hardware that's required over time.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, would it be fair to say to the listeners out there, if you don't do anything else, at least consider a POC? Just identify a use case that kind of can focus the mind. You get the hang of the containerization and the way that this stuff works, and then you'll get a better feel, because that's part of the problem, isn't it? To just feel what it feels like.
Exactly. Like even in a smaller deployment, you could do a fixed wireless where you're literally just taking the cellular signal coming into a router basically, and then cascading that out as wired Ethernet or Wi-Fi. You know, those are the smaller type deployments that are perfect. Like a private or a hybrid deployment is obviously for a larger enterprise, but there's lots of opportunity and use cases to use 5G in lots of different ways. Just it's empowering to give your workforce the ability to be connected anywhere from anywhere, anytime, securely, remotely, whatever the case may be. And that's what people want. They want flexibility and choice, and they don't want the technology to be a drag on them. So lots of opportunity.
Howard, any last thoughts?
My recommendation would be think about your use case.
Yeah.
Right? Think about those things you'd like to do, but there's that thing back in the back of your mind going, well, we're already stressing our network now. It'd be nice to be able to do this, but it can't be down. It'd be nice to be able to do this, but we can't handle the data. It'd be nice to be able to do this, but the latency is too great. Right?
Yep.
And then think about should you look at 5G? I'm not telling anyone to jump off the cliff, right?
No, do your due diligence, do the research. And as you said, look and see, does it make sense? Is there a business case there? Don't kind of try to force fit the technology. That's stupid. Like really understand what the potential is and what are you trying to do, where you're trying to go. Yep. And are you bound today by your current network?
Sure. At the same time, don't wait until the business has created an urgency and you have to leap off that cliff making decisions. Right?
Yeah.
So
what you mean, like every other time?
Right. Right. So now's a good time to recognize that you don't have the pressures of the business saying we must enable this new technology, we must enable this new feature. Instead, you have the opportunity to look to the future. You have the opportunity to kind of see the horizon and be prepared for what's coming.
And obviously, because I'm talking to GigHome, I mean, one of the things I love about you guys is the radar reports, right? You do amazing research, test and validate the solutions as opposed to kind of just, see what's out there, like really distill it down. So GigHome has done a great report on the hybrid 5G. Your colleague Ian did that. I think it was out in January of this year. That's amazing. So, go to GigHome, get informed, get educated, see what the landscape looks like, see what the use cases described within are. And if it makes sense, reach out to GigHome or reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you. And, we could just see. I mean, it's not going to be a hard sell. It's just going to be a conversation as to fit.
Fair play.
Well, on that note, this has been another episode of The Good, the Bad, and the Techie. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've got questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. But, if you don't and you appreciated it, like, subscribe, share. And we'll see you on our next episode. Thanks again, Karl. This has been great.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you.